Russia's foreign minister has accused the West of becoming directly involved in the war in Ukraine by supplying weapons and training soldiers. A global tourism summit has wrapped up in Saudi Arabia with sustainability and the rising cost of travel dominating talks. Russia's foreign minister has accused the West of becoming directly involved in the war in Ukraine by supplying it with weapons and training soldiers. Sergei Lavrov told a reporter Russian strikes on Ukrainian energy facilities were to supposedly derail shipments of Western weapons.
We disable energy facilities in Ukraine that allow to pump Ukraine with deadly weapons to kill Russians. So don't say that the United States and NATO are not involved in this war. You are directly involved.
On Wednesday, NATO pledged to supply more high-tech arms to Ukraine. The West's delivery of military hardware has helped turn the tide of the war in recent months.
Today we will discuss Russia's war of aggression and...
Russia is increasingly targeting critical infrastructure following Ukraine's recapture of Kherson last month. The attacks, which have killed scores of residents, have been widely condemned by the international community. Lavrov, however, insists that Moscow remains open for talks on ending the conflict.
Russian efforts around Bakhmut indicate that Russian forces have fundamentally failed to learn from previous high-casualty campaigns concentrated on objectives of limited operational or strategic significance. This is the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War. Russian forces have continually expanded combat strength on small settlements around Bakhmut since the end of May. In the following 6 months, they have only secured gains on the order of a few kilometers at a time. As the Institute for the Study of War has previously observed, Russian efforts to advance on Bakhmut have resulted in the continued attrition of Russian manpower and equipment, pinning troops on relatively insignificant settlements for weeks and months at a time. Now, this pattern of operations closely resembles the previous Russian efforts to take Severodonetsk and Lysychansk earlier in the war. As the Institute for the Study of War assessed, through June and July this year, Ukrainian forces essentially allowed Russian troops to concentrate efforts on Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, two cities near the Luhansk region border of limited operational and strategic significance, in order to capitalize on the continued degradation of Russian manpower and equipment over the course of months of grinding combat. Russian efforts in this area have remained largely stalled along the lines that they have reached in early July. Even if Russian troops continue to advance towards and within Bakhmut, and even if they force a controlled Ukrainian withdrawal from the city, as was the case in Lysychansk, Bakhmut itself offers them little operational benefit. The costs associated with 6 months of brutal grinding and attrition-based combat around Bakhmut far outweigh any operational advantage that the Russians can obtain from taking Bakhmut. On the other hand, Russian offensives around Bakhmut are consuming a significant proportion of Russia's available combat power, potentially facilitating continued Ukrainian counteroffensives elsewhere.
Russia says it's captured a few settlements in eastern Ukraine, eager for a win after a series of setbacks. The heaviest fighting at the moment is in Bakhmut. Elderly and disabled people are being helped by volunteers to leave the area on trains as the war intensifies.
It's scary. Only the dead are not afraid, and we still want to live. Nobody needs a dead worker of the service that evacuates people. As long as we're alive, we can help.
The last 4 days have been unbearable. Projectiles fly back and forth, rockets. The children's apartment was broken. There's no apartment. It's very The evacuation comes as Bakhmut has been dubbed the meat grinder due to the brutal trench warfare, artillery duels and frontal assaults.
The French President Emmanuel Macron says he'll confront his American counterpart, Joe Biden, over the subsidies contained in the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as the IRA. At the French embassy in Washington, Macron said the subsidies paid to US companies under a vast green energy plan could split the West. However, the White House says they welcome discussions about the topic.
European partners have expressed concerns about the IRA. So I think we would have every expectation that it might come up. In fact, we welcome that conversation. The president last month stood up a task force, a US-EU task force specifically around the IRA so that we could better understand European concerns about it. And so that we could frankly share our perspectives on the IRA, and particularly around clean energy.
Despite the comment, Macron called the French-US alliance stronger than anything as he wrapped up the first day of his state visit. He said, "If I am returning to Washington and if I'm going to meet with President Biden right after seeing you, it's with a view to try and be worthy of the bonds that our history has forged between us, an alliance stronger than anything." Macron also visited NASA, called for the International Monetary Fund to be reformed to better tackle climate change, and attended a ceremony at the Arlington National Cemetery, all on day one. Today he's due to have talks with President Biden.
The WTTC Global Summit wrapped up in Saudi with speakers from the CEO of Hilton to Ban Ki-moon discussing issues from supply and demand to sustainability and the rising cost of travel.
Also pulling a crowd on day two was American actor Edward Norton, who spoke exclusively to Euronews about his passion for filmmaking and making a positive environmental impact.
The real challenge is to actually bring our whole economic framework into alignment with sustainability. It's the challenge of our era.
Europe was discussed by some delegates against the backdrop of flight cancellations, staff shortages and the spectre of recession. One MEP, who is chair of the Tourism Task Force, told Euronews that Europe's tourism sector risked being left behind if it didn't develop a cohesive plan of action.
We had to have a very specific and detailed strategy in tourism, and if we don't do that, it is a threat that we cannot afford by ourselves.
He added that Europe should be careful not to take repeat tourism for granted, adding that cross-border knowledge sharing was key.
We have 27 different member states. Each of us is different, but we need to think as a whole. But for that, you need that political need.
Sounding upbeat, the CEO of Radisson confirmed the group's 5-year plan to double their portfolio.
If you look to Europe, Middle East and Africa, Radisson was already the brand that signed most hotels in January, June 2022. If you look to China, we signed more than 200 hotels in the last 2 years.
The CEO added that people wanted better packages to work in such a demanding sector and to help fill the 126 million new jobs over the next decade.
When you have people who are telling you, listen, the conditions in hospitality are difficult, we need to compensate both short-term and long-term. So I think we need to increase the level of flexibility.
Flexibility and adaptability have been key words for the tourism industry throughout the pandemic, but also, it appears, for the years to come.
14,000 pelicans and other seabirds have been killed by bird flu in Peru. On the beaches of the city of Lima, workers from the Peruvian National Agricultural Health Service have had to remove the dead birds. The current highly contagious H5N1 avian flu outbreak began in Canada and spread to the US. It's already seen a record 50 million avian deaths, according to the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Peru first issued a health alert last Thursday after confirming 3 cases of H5B1 in pelicans. At least 2 people have been killed and dozens are missing after a landslide in southern Brazil, which hit a section of highway. Around 20 cars and trucks were swept along with the mud that rushed down a steep hillside after heavy rain, according to authorities. Rescue workers say the bad weather and remote location complicated the search effort. Firefighters say that between 30 and 50 people are missing. Drones with heat-detecting cameras were used in the hope of finding more survivors.